recall a bit my childhood. I was raised in the Western German coal and mining district, the Ruhr area. And I played, well, there was a little like row house garden, but mostly what I played with were then the slag heaps and the ponds and rail yards and all these post-industrial landscapes in the middle of the city of Essen. A very constructed environment, but still, that was my landscape. And of course, I also felt the urge to leave, see something else. I think became very curious to see just places beyond all these slag heaps and ponds and rail yards. And after my school time, I moved to other places. And I think these have influenced me a lot. Like Paris, a historic city with glamorous buildings and parks where I studied architecture. Stuttgart, a metropolitan region spreading out over green hills. And here I engaged with urbanism studies. Marseille, a harbor city with large industrial areas, pockets of Provençal villages and Mediterranean fields, and all of which I biked to understand the landscape. It was like getting to know this city as one might get to know the body of a person. So it was very tangible and almost like seeing the skin of the landscape, listening to the voice of the landscape. So that was very emotional, but also I think gave me the essence of what I think is exploring landscapes, to be very much in touch. And then eventually I also came to Berlin, where I didn't study landscape architecture, urbanism, or architecture, but I studied journalism, because by then I was convinced that I had to be able to speak about what I was doing and also to transfer to other people what we are now all doing. Well, then I worked in Copenhagen, where I got my PhD in landscape architecture, a very watery city, the Netherlands, very watery too, very wet. But then also Spain, Algeria, Argentina now, Australia, always a bit in the meantime, mostly hot and mostly dry. And that is how all these conditions of hot and cold, of dry and wet, constantly changing, exposed to the dynamics of these natural processes, but also to the human or more cultural processes, technological changes, economic shifts, social movements, gave me the impression that what my motivation over all these experiences in my career were trying to was to accept landscape as something very dynamic and ever-changing, in which processes we can intervene as designers. I would say I'm maybe an urban landscape architect, but at the same time, it also led me to understand over the turn of the century, when the sustainability discourse came up, to follow what once a Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Jan Eliasson, said, that the battle of sustainability will most likely be won or lost in our cities. And then I think I followed pretty much the writings of Neil Brenner, who's not a landscape architect, an architect, a sociologist, and who studied interrelationships and who speaks about planetary urbanization. And with my landscape lens, I would understand that the remote landscapes of the Australian outback were pretty much corresponding to what happened in the cities, because over there, the open cast mining was taking place in order to, for example, comply with the need of energy of the cities on the coastal outline of Australia.
So after your journalism work and also your studies in spatial practices, you basically ended up in academia. What shifted your direction?
Yeah, good question. And I think there's things that shifted in my career, others not. I think what has never shifted is this passion to explore landscapes like bodies, as I described before, like bodies or other beings to interact with, you could also say. And I was pretty much inspired by the time then by an early explorer, a historic figure, Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian who went to sail the world and who refused to think at distance, like many others of his time. And for that reason, he engaged in exploration trips. He sailed to the Americas, pretty much unexplored at the time. I'm speaking about early 19th century. And he wanted to set foot on Earth to better understand what's really going on there. And wanted to go against all these other arrogant Europeans who sat in their capitals like London and Paris and Madrid and Lisbon and thought they would understand everything from afar. And this is somehow an attitude that I then have turned into a long-term research project, because I understood that this is nothing I could eventually practice in an office or in a municipal service. And I teamed up with a colleague of mine from Australia, Jenny Lee, and it's a project we continue doing. It's long-term. It's called the Traveling Transect, pretty much a landscape project. What I think has shifted is my way of thinking how I could best engage with practice. Because I'm considering myself now as a straddler between practice and academia. And while being in practice, I think I always missed the tools of understanding what I was doing. I was not able somehow to escape my own restricted mindset. And for this reason, I think I eventually became attracted by theory and by going a little bit outside of my own bubble. So I became a researcher to be able to critically reflect on practice with new intellectual tools, theory and literature, of course, among them, new ways of thinking and new ways of understanding. And I think that's what I today would like to translate through my publishing as a journalist and for professional practice, not necessarily academic journals only, but also through teaching, to offer these tools of understanding to the next generation, to maybe even also serve as mind opener and to educate them as what I would call reflective practitioners. But that sort of reflection for me resides in critical thinking, criticality we call it sometimes, also basing this on critical theory. And all these areas of critical thinking, of invoking theory to use to practice, means to activate the power of thinking to destabilize apparently stable worlds. So it's taking a critical stance, means to take risks. Of course, I do take risks in sometimes questioning seemingly academic certainties, like the disciplines. So in a way, with criticality, I also aim to not only undiscipline myself, but also my colleagues. Because thinking in boxes, in disciplines, might not necessarily help us any longer in our wish to forward urban futures. And the landscape perspective, of course, is my driving force, because I can relate these different, distinctive disciplinary angles with each other, as any landscape architect can relate the urban fragments with each other.
And during your professional path, you also worked as a personal advisor to the chief city architect in Munich, and consulted also on similar jobs elsewhere. What were your maybe main responsibilities, objectives, but also how did you see from another perspective the work that is necessary for changes to happen in the urban environment, for example?
Yeah, sure. I think I moved into a municipal service because I found that professional practice often is hampered by those rules that municipalities put out. And I wanted to understand why this is so. So in a way, the 6 years I was working in the planning service in Munich allowed me to understand the mechanics of operation between public administration and politics, and how one could navigate or straddle in between in order to then not only understand this framework, but also operate within it and maybe invoke changes. Because I'm convinced that designers could be better designers if sometimes their frameworks would be better. In this respect, of course, I did never become a head of a public administration. I went into academia because I could more freely think critically there. But I'm convinced and also often encouraged by my fellows or colleagues that if we went there more often as landscape architects and other designers, we could improve a lot. And I just remember my professor at Stuttgart University, Klaus Humpert, who was the head of a municipal service in Freiburg in the south of Germany, who was once asked what would he have been doing differently if he would become a professor once again in a new life, so to say. And he said he would much more encourage the young ones, the students, the brilliant spirits, to engage with public administration and with politics. Because at his time, he said, civil service was more or less where the lazy bums went. And we need the most brilliant spirits there.
Could you stress any specific articles, essays, or moments in your career that you believe best encapsulate your philosophy as a landscape architect, as an academic, as a reflective practitioner?
Yeah, sure. Of course, there's a lot, but I think 3 books that have meant a lot to me, still mean a lot to me, would be the ones I like to quote here. The first, I think, is called The Radicant by Nicolas Bourriot, who was a French art critic, who refers to botany in saying maybe today's world we do not need the radicals, like these plants that anchor and have one root, but we need to be inspired more by the radicants, which are plants that develop secondary roots, like strawberries or ivy, and that can manage much more easily to adapt to new terrain that appears in front of them. And in a way, I feel myself as I'm a radicant. Then I think I mentioned Helga Nowotny, former European Research Council president. She's been writing a book called The Cunning of Uncertainty, in which she deploys a little bit this idea of maybe not necessarily taking uncertainty always as a negative state of the world, but in having it understood as something that holds a promise that it could be otherwise, and we can use our creativity to get there. And finally, inspired by my position now in the Global South, I'm reading up more of the scholars who do develop theories of the South. And I'd like to quote Arturo Escobar, who's a Colombian anthropologist, who has written a book called Designs for the Pluriverse, and who posits that we should maybe not consider any longer living in a universe, one voice, but, as he says, a pluriverse with many voices, and that we do have to have the task to go along with all these voices and find out how to cooperate.
And you are also the founder and editor-in-chief of LAE, Landscape Architecture Europe, and also co-editor-in-chief of Scape, the international magazine for landscape architecture. And through your work and the work of your colleagues, of course, both publications established great relevance, voice, and influence in the profession. Do you also see them as some of your most important achievements, and how they were started, based on what kind of ideas? Can you tell a little bit?
Yeah, I think, well, they started with a person who I think is a reflective practitioner, just as I mentioned the term before. Michael van Gessel, the Dutch landscape architect, who by the time, around the 2000s, was the Dutch delegate to the European Federation of Landscape Architecture, today IFLA Europe, and who, for me, was always the strongest voice of landscape architecture by the time, who dared to speak up, who took action, and who also, I think, constantly moved himself to move others. And that's what he did within this European Association of Landscape Architecture, who of course has its own agenda, and they gather and they try to formulate rules for the profession, but also to shape a profile for the profession. And he thought it's not enough to just sit there and write up rules, but maybe we should much more powerfully showcase what landscape architecture is all about. And he thought it should be a book. I mean, we were speaking by the early 2000s, there were not so many books about landscape architecture, and definitely not about European landscape architecture. So he took action, talked to his colleagues in the Netherlands. They founded a foundation with which you can fundraise, and under the auspices of IFLA Europe, were gathering the conditions to create a book, which then ultimately became Landscape Architecture Europe. And I think what I see as an achievement, not only mine, but I think of all this collective work, which I think is very important to mention, because we cannot work alone these days, is to having created a formula that would not just publish anything, like anybody today can publish anything, but we were having a strict process of editing a call, inviting landscape architects to send projects in, gathering a jury of practitioners from all over Europe to select those projects into a book or a compendium of both work and thought that was, or still is, composed by an editorial team together with a great team of producers, all based in the Netherlands still, and publish something like a critical review, or even also a reflective practitioner's review every 3 years. So a whole process that we have been carrying out now, or will be carrying out now for the 7th time, a book every 3 years, fundraised completely by ourselves, still under the auspices of IFLA Europe, and 20 years of reflective practice, you could say, in the form of a book, which is not digital. And still we like the material, as we are landscape architects, and all our world around is material. Scape, the magazine, has at the beginning more or less been a side product, because in engaging in this first process of creating the first Landscape Architecture Europe book, we got so much material, we got so much thought and inspiration, and we also got a lot that was going beyond Europe, and we got a lot that was going beyond landscape architecture. So we thought there needs to be a second platform combining landscape architecture and urbanism, which we see very close together. And from my being an urban landscape architect, I think it was quite natural. And also to understand, as we always do in landscape architecture, the relations, manifold relations between Europe and the world. And that was Scape, which then also has become or gone beyond the print product only. So it has also various digital formats and will still evolve, I would think, because again, this is agile, but it's also very much depending on how are the conditions and can we find the funds. And as you all know, this is very fluid conditions. So we started the whole process in 2005, and the first book, LIE book, was out 2006. Likewise, the first Scape magazine was out 2006. Landezine, I think, was 2009. And I think it is quite interesting to observe the first 10 years almost of the 21st century in terms of landscape architectural publication. Because when we started with LIE and Scape, not much was around. And then there was a proliferation. And I think today, if I observe, I'm really proud of the profession to have been doing, officers have been doing their monographs, and there's a lot of reflective publications also out there now. And I think what you have achieved with Landezine, which is a platform of the most topical. I think you are news brokers. You are delivering an overview for anyone who wants to get access, because it's digital and can get access easily, browse through a very well-organized web structure.
Oh, thank you.
And what I think this has provided the profession is that sort of easy go-to platform, which I think we with doing books or magazines and partly analog, can never achieve. But I also think that we do coexist quite well in those particular formats. For example, a book, much more going into depth, much more presenting critical thinking, much more exploring maybe disciplines that are to the sides, philosophy that comes into the game. And Scape is some more focused, thematically oriented medium, which I think as a landscape of landscape media is a perfect setting. So we got somewhere since 2000. So if I even reflect back into the 90s, when I was part of the team with Robert Schaefer that started Topos, European landscape magazine, which was an incredible act of creating something that would go beyond national landscape media that were partly at the time also, very contained in their own national bubbles and promoting a national discourse, which of course was important. But the 90s were the decennia when the markets would be deregulated, where people or landscape architects could work across borders. And I think that was the medium that was just needed. And that was analog, of course, because we were sending, when I was part of the editorial team, sending manuscripts through the fax machine or getting a floppy disk sent by regular, like snail mail. And that's definitely a different condition to today. And Topos was, for me, a revelation of, having European landscape architecture as my fingertips. And I think this was a pioneer period, which, of course, then coming into the 2000s, developed into a broader spectrum of landscape media. Topos itself developed into international and being also partly, of course, a medium that publishes online. Coexists, I think, quite nicely with whatever we have and we should have.
What are the main blind spots, views, notions landscape architects should focus more on?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge to some point that we are working in a moment of crisis, of ecological crisis, of course. The talk about climate change is very obvious and omnipresent, but also of social crisis with, I think, we all know about migration and poverty around the world. We do have all these notions within the sustainability agenda. And I tend to think along the lines of former European Research Council President Helga Novotny, who is also seeing a crisis as something that is a state where an old order doesn't hold anymore, and maybe a new order is not yet completely defined on the horizon. And there's that sort of very ambiguous moment in between, which she, in a little essay, calls, "That's just a state of mess." And then mess, she says, is maybe not so negative as we tend to understand it, because it is, what she says, a moment that comes when one order loses traction. And in this moment of mess, you still, as humans, and I think as designers in particular, you have the possibility to orient and maybe see if that mess can land, or if you do not do anything, it probably lands in disorder, but it might also land in a new order. So there's the notions of order, disorder, with mess in the middle, which is a promise. And that's probably not too bad. And I think as landscape architects, we do, of course, know that we cannot solve this situation alone. Maybe no one can solve it at all, but we can move it towards maybe a new order. And landscape architects are quite agile, as designers are, thinking ahead, being creative. And I always also think of the ideas or the definitions of design. What is design? That's what we all do, and we think we know what it is. But it can be many more things. As Herbert Simon, a Nobel Prize winner in the 60s, already said, design is to turn existing situations into desired ones. And then it can be everything from the engineer developing a new motor, the city official drafting a new policy for social housing, or the landscape architect drawing a new plan for a park. In this respect, we are probably now based in an epoch where everybody designs. And I think that is a little bit of a, maybe it's not a blind spot, but I would think a situation where landscape architects could become a bit more conscious about how to position themselves as expert designers, because we all have a very clear education and we know how to deal with space and the social implications of space. But around us are a lot of people who are what Ezio Manzini, who's an Italian design theoretician, calls diffuse designers. That are lay people, that are other experts, that are politicians, who all are, in a way, the way of Herbert Simon, designers. So how to co-design with those? How to not lose our expertise, but still adopt a little bit of a moderate or modest position also of accepting the others to co-design with oneself. And that, I think, is it's in a way also related to the question of thinking differently than we did in 20th century, when the modernist ideology dominated, where we all were trained as designers who draft a big master plan and carry it out. And we know we have a lot of master planners in the sense of great geniuses who are fantastic designers, but I kind of stumble over the fact that often, well, also they are male, and they're always perceived as demiurge, almost like gods. And I don't think that this is a position or a posture that we can claim today in an epoch where everybody designs and where we live in crisis, where the mess is overall present, and where we might find ways in more agilely moving towards, well, co-working with those who are around us in a site-specific way, while having in mind that whatever we do on one plot has implications for any other place on the globe.
Is there a particular approach to the design process that is especially appealing to you, maybe? What kind of projects usually move you, and if you can name a few projects? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think because you say being moved by, I first of all think of the landscape scholar Elizabeth Mayer from the US, who suggested that we should add aesthetics to the sustainability triad. And mostly it's ecology, economy, the social. And she thinks that the aesthetic component that we always have at our fingertips as landscape architects is able to move people to maybe also join a behavior that is more sustainable in our everyday lives. And with this idea in mind, I think I'm particularly interested in projects who work with these everyday life environments, large scale, small scale. It can be, landscape architecture can really go from the smallest spot to the largest region. And I'm thinking of, for me, a very seminal project that has been lasting since a while, the Iba-Emscher Park in the German coal district where I grew up. And that's probably partly why it moves me. One of their directors, Tom Sieverts, who's a German urbanist, has written the seminal book of the Zwischenstadt, cities in between cities, which relates, I think, to this quest that we are seeing here right now in the How Do We Aglo exhibition, the lost sites, the overlooked spots. And that's, I think, what still moves me, because it has been lasting for so long. It has kicked off a whole process of transforming an old industrial region into more livable spaces. And for, that endeavor, which yields effects today, people think differently about their region than they thought in, let's say, the 80s or 70s. And that is an achievement, I think. It's a project that I feel very important. More contemporary projects, but also long-term, large-scale, I think, are always, one of them is the Ile de Nantes in the French western city of Nantes, conceived by the office of Alexandre Chemetov, landscape architect and architect in France, who refused to draft a master plan for this big 330 hectares harbor industrial site conversion, and instead proposed a plan guide, like a guideline plan, which is much more flexible and much more adaptable than a stiff master plan. And he also suggested to not change everything, but incrementally, spot by spot, and revising the whole process over and over again. The project today is led by Jacqueline Hosty, a French landscape architect too, with Claire Shorter, a French urban planner, and a team, obviously, because you never do things alone. And Jacqueline Hosty, for me, is a person who brings the affective into landscapes once again, and also in a very small scale endeavor in working with water in particular in this field, and combining natural elements with the constructed environments of such a site. Another project I think I would like to mention is the Parc aux Angéliques in Bordeaux, again a southern French city by Michel Desvignes, paysagist. And I find this interesting because it's not a park that's planned once all over, but it's something, or it's a work that develops in steps as a landscape laboratory, you could almost say. It works with afforestation, so trees and vegetation plays a great role, but within an urban setting and within a very strict geometrical outline of this urban district. And it is an ongoing work, so it is ever-changing. And what maybe all three of them tell me is that landscape architects are able to create something I would like to call an aesthetics of the transitory. Not like architecture having one building as an object. It lasts as it is, or should at least, for a while. I would like to then maybe complement the aesthetics of the transitory with works that are mostly not necessarily directed by style in landscape architecture, but by sites, and there might be physical sites, but also social sites or cultural sites. And I'm thinking of a colleague of mine, Kamel Louafi, who's an Algerian-born German landscape architect, who just recently won the highest federal award in Germany called the Bundesverdienstkreuz. Not many landscape architects hold this distinction for his lifetime achievements. And he basically meandered in his career from creating the landscapes of the World Exhibition in Hanover in 2000 to now being engaged in projects like a traveling pyramid, temporary, that would question colonialist heritage in Europe. And his attitude, I think, could best be described as creating an aesthetics of tolerance, which I think is also very important for landscape architecture today, and even to showcase to other designers that the tolerance and the transitory are maybe important values in an epoch of crisis, and in order to find ways of navigating out of the mess and into the next order.
Since you mentioned you move a lot across Europe and also across the world, so I'm just curious, what advice would you give me on how to learn 7 foreign languages you speak?
It's probably due to the fact that I consider myself as a radicant, and I think I can only advise you or anyone who wants to go learn more languages to do so. Anchor for a while in particular soils, and then develop new routes to again anchor in new soils, which always come with the language that is needed to converse and feel very much at home each time you land there.
Lisa Diedrich, thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you so much, Zaš.